And this growth path, again, is unprecedented and is really challenging to our ability to meet that demand. So I also, just to put it in context, this is today a primarily US-centric problem. Of course, data center demand is growing globally, but when we look at where it really is having the biggest impact, it is very much here in the US and to a lesser extent, China and the EU. And if we want to put that in context, how big is this issue? It's big in the sense from a climate perspective, data centers will be sort of the fourth largest source of emissions if we were to compare it to countries, obviously well after China and the US, but essentially the size of India by 2030 in terms of global emissions. So we've got a big issue here in terms of use of power and the related greenhouse gas emissions that go with that. And lastly, just an aside, it's not what I want to talk about today, but of course there's a different implication here of this growth in power demand from data centers, which is the implication for power prices in the country, and this is going to have political implications. You're already hearing about it. You'll hear more about it in the elections this fall. But then again, this is just another form of evidence that we're just seeing a changing environment where power prices have been very stable for the last couple of decades, and now they're starting to jump. So what I really want to talk about was what are the solutions to this AI demand for power? And given those solutions, what is the implication for climate change? So the wrap up, the takeaway here, and then we just open it up to Q&A. Because of course, as you know, the neat thing about power, electricity, can be generated in so many different ways. And it's a pure commodity. It's actually perhaps the purest commodity out there because you can't even really tell where the electrons were produced, right? Electron's electron. And whatever you're pointing to a plug, whatever the technology is being used to produce that electron is kind of irrelevant to the customer. They just need electrons when they want them. So what are those solutions today? Wind, and I put in brackets, and battery storage, because increasingly, as we'll discuss, it's paired with battery storage. Solar, again, paired with battery storage. Nuclear, and many different versions of nuclear, which I'll talk about in a sec. Geothermal, traditional, and what's now called enhanced geothermal, which is an important area. Natural gas combined cycle, which is traditional natural gas generation. Natural gas fuel cells. And lastly, demand curtailment. Okay. Now, these are not the only solutions. There are other ways of generating power in the country. There's hydro, for example, other ways. But these are the solutions to this growth in power demand in America. It's an American-centric perspective because that's where most of the growth is in this area. So the other solutions are either pretty small at this point, diesel gensets, or there are large solutions, but they're not growing because we don't have any more capacity like hydro. So what I want to do is take us through each one of these seven. I'm going to spend a couple moments on each seven to understand what are the dynamics of each of these. And then the next thing I want to say is, after we start talking about the technology dynamics of each one, understand how does a customer, whether it's a data center or just any consumer utility, how do they choose among them? Because they all produce the same product. They all produce the same pure commodity, which is electricity. What are the variables? And the big takeaway there, just to bury the lead, is the variables that used to work in the past have changed. How power is being decided upon today is quite different from what it was until very recently. So quick solutions to add power demand today. The first solution is, what's the incumbent? In other words, what are people using today when they say, I need more power? I'm a utility, I need more power. I'm a data center, I need more power. The incumbent actually surprises people because the incumbent today is wind, solar, and battery storage. More than 90% of all new power generation in America last year in 2025 was wind, solar, and batteries. It wasn't fossil fuels. It wasn't any of the other solutions. That was last year. This year, 2026, when we're now well into the Trump administration, it's still wind, solar, and battery storage. Okay, this is the incumbent solution. So when we think about electricity generation, we tend to immediately go to fossil fuels. That's actually not quite the case in America today. It's quite different from that. Why is that? Why are wind, solar, and battery storage that way? Because today in much of the country, these are the cheapest solutions, right? And that's a mix of really cheap technology today. It's extremely competitive technology. And then you've got subsidies on top of that. Now, of course, some of those subsidies are going away soon, but particularly in solar, there's been so much safe harboring of the subsidies that people keep using them for several years, even after they're gone. If you want details on that, I can explain how that works. And then batteries, there's still several more years. We still have another six or 7 years of subsidy baked into the OBBB. Wind is a different story. Wind is really declining use. But it all comes down to a simple quote from Lazard: this is your cheapest solution. And by and large, customers, when it comes to power, they just want cheap, right? Cheap electrons investments. So that's our incumbent solution. Nuclear. So nuclear is a little more complex because, of course, there's many different forms of nuclear generation. Traditional conventional fission, 20% of the US grid, roughly, maybe less than 20% today of generation. The issue with conventional nuclear, more than 10 years to build a nuclear power plant, almost impossible to get it permitted, and it's expensive. Right? If we go back to solar and wind, we're talking about levelized costs, let's say $37 a megawatt hour. Here we're talking about costs of over $100, 3 times expensive. So why is nuclear even in the mix today? Because of new technologies. Two forms. One is SMR, small modular reactors. These are currently in development. The advantage of a small modular reactor is it has the potential to be much cheaper than traditional. Why? Because traditional reactors are all custom built. Every one is bespoke. These are massive projects, right? A small modular reactor is built in a factory, and it has the potential to be built in a way that you can replicate over and over again and drive down the costs. The advantage of this is you could potentially get an LCOE as low as $50 or $60, and they're highly distributable. So you're building in a factory and you're putting in a location. We need it here, we need it here, a data center here, and so on. So that's very appealing to customers. The challenge with it is none of them exist quite yet. There's actually some that are very close to operational. The first project probably not really going to be online at commercial stage till 2030. That's still at least 4 years away. And given what we're seeing in the ramp up of power demand, that's not a great solution, but it's a possibility. A lot of excitement around that. And then the other technology, of course, is fusion. Every nuclear power plant in the world today is fission. Right? The splitting in the atom. Fusion is the combining two atoms together. Far more potential in terms of generating power. That's pretty exciting. But the technological hurdles around fusion to commercialize are immense. There's talk that you'll have operational fusion to mid to late 2030s. It's a technology that's always been a decade in the future. Always has been. Maybe always will be a decade in the future. That being said, that's sort of the most exciting area of potential with a lot of challenges ahead. So that's nuclear. Our third potential solution here is geothermal. Conventional geothermal is when you drill a hole down to find a reservoir of hot water in a pocket below the Earth's surface. You pump that hot water up. You use that heat to turn a turbine, and you produce electricity. The problems with conventional geothermal is you got to find reservoirs of hot water, and they only exist in a few places in the world. Some countries like Iceland have a lot of it, but the U.S. in particular, it doesn't have much. And essentially, the reservoirs are tapped. We've found that resource, and we're done. It's only a small percentage, but 3% of power generation. Not a great resource for growth. In fact, there's really no growth there. But there's something new called an enhanced geothermal. It's a very new technology. You don't look for hot water. You just look for hot rock. And it turns out there's a lot of hot rock below the surface of the Earth. In fact, the entire below the surface, it's all hot rock, right? If you go far enough down. So what's going on here? It's using new technology. It's using hydraulic fracturing technology that's been refined in the oil and gas industry to drill into hot rock, fracture the rock, then pump cold water down there, just air temperature water, doesn't have to be cold. It is heated up by that hot rock, and then you pull the hot water back up to the surface. So it's a way of creating reservoirs. There's a lot of interest in this technology at the moment. It's just become commercialized really in the past year. First commercial projects, about 400 megawatts. And while the cost today is quite high because it's the very first projects, there's a good sight line to a competitive cost within the coming decade. So a lot of interest in this because it's using US technology. It's 24/7 firm power, no CO2 emissions, and it might get cheap. It's not yet cheap today, though. Natural gas combined cycle. That's a third of all power generation in America today. America does have abundant gas. New build does require pipelines, but that's not so much of a challenge. And it's pretty cost competitive, between $50 and $100 per megawatt hour. The challenge with natural gas is a strange one. You can't get the turbines. So you can get the gas, you can burn the gas, but getting the turbines to turn that into power, there's a backlog on that. There's only really 3 companies in the world that make those turbines. In the last big boom in power, and this is around the growth of the internet in the late 90s and early 2000s, these companies expanded dramatically, and then demand dropped off, and they all lost money, and it was a very bad experience for them. And so they've been very slow to build capacity. So more use of natural gas has been impeded by the absence of turbines. Natural gas can also be used in a different way through a fuel cell. Fuel cell converts without burning the gas, convert natural gas to power. It has the advantages that you can do this on site. So you can put a fuel cell generation pretty much anywhere. You can put it next to your building here, or next to a data center, or next to a town that needs power. It's quiet, and there's low local air pollution because you're not burning the gas, though it does emit CO2. As I mentioned before, there is abundant gas here. You can also power with hydrogen, in which case you have 0 CO2 emissions. That's advantageous. But the cost is high. It's a pretty expensive way of generating electricity. Nevertheless, despite being expensive, it's become extremely popular as a way of creating incremental power demand in America today. The leading company is called Bloom. The company's become incredibly valuable in the past year. I actually visited their factory last month in the San Francisco Bay Area, and they are just building as fast as they can. They can't build these things fast enough to meet consumer demand for more power in the country. And the last solution here is simply demand curtailment. So the problem with power is not having enough generation to meet demand. The problem is having enough generation to meet demand at the peak loads, right? Because power generation, of course, in the middle of the night, people don't use a lot of electricity. And then, of course, in the daytime, they use more electricity for work and for air conditioning and all sorts of other things. And you need the generation capacity to meet the peaks. Always, you must have enough capacity to meet the peaks. Well, the interesting thing about AI in particular is there's nothing that suggests that AI has to run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You can pause it, particularly in the training mode, right? You're training these AI, and they train these systems for 3 to 6 months at a time, running 24 hours a day. They can pause the training. So the study is done down at the Nicholas Institute at Duke that basically said, if you just pause the use of AI at the peaks, which is that little part that's sort of shaved here, that alone will allow us to free up many gigawatts of power generation. It doesn't create new generation. It just means you don't have to build additional generation, right? There's no cost associated with this. There's no emissions associated with this. What we don't know is whether the hyperscalers, AI companies, are willing to do it. Like, does it interfere with their business? And if so, how much? But it's a solution for sure. I want to get into the key factors when adding power generation. But before I do that, let me just stop on the introduction to the 7 solutions that we have. Any questions on that? Anything I've introduced that didn't make any sense at all, or just wanted to dig deeper? We're good on that. That one Zoom's good. I can't see, so you let me know. Yeah, sure.
So I guess you had that figure earlier showing the 100% on the order 100% increase in prices. Is this because the power companies can have increased demand and they need to fill it, or they're getting enough money that they can just charge?
So what's happening is demand is going up, right? Data centers and others are just saying we need more electricity. And how does the price get set? The price gets set essentially in the wholesale markets. And you sort of think about this, there's always got to be, one of the challenges of electricity is you guys have to have demand, rough balance between supply and demand. because it's hard to store electricity. Obviously, there's batteries, but it's, we still don't have that much storage capacity. And so the price is really determined by the marginal demand, right? Now, for the consumer, the average consumer, the household, you don't see that, right? Your utility is probably regulated, or even it's deregulated. Your bill is sort of locked in. But over time, that price gets pushed up. So in fact, what that graph shows is a wholesale price. Oh, skipping way back here, right? This is actually increasing the wholesale power prices. Consumers aren't yet feeling too much of it, but they're starting to. They're starting to see, because the wholesale price goes up, the intermediary, which is the utility, has to pass that on at some point, right? Or they're going to lose money and eventually go out of business. So you'll start to see that flow through. And that's why I say that this is going to become a much bigger issue as consumers start to feel the pain of rising prices. Right? Any other questions on the tech part of it? The solutions? Yeah, hi.
Sorry, you said the demand curtailment. I was just wondering if there is any government effort to do that type of policy.
To force it? Oh, it's a great question. I don't know the answer to that question, but I would be shocked if there was. And there are a lot of reasons for that. One is, this whole thing's moving so fast that the regulatory part of it's way behind. And two is, I don't know of any, well, there are very few examples of government forcing curtailment in any industry. Because you sort of think about it for a second, yeah, curtailment, if it's not voluntary, it can be very disruptive to people, right? Essentially what it is a forced blackout. It's saying that, you will not have power. And in a modern economy like ours, that is very hard on a consumer. Right? You can imagine if suddenly a government said, you know what, sorry, the next 20 minutes, you don't get any power. And particularly for a place like hospitals, it's just not really that realistic. Where demand curtailment works, and it's widely used, by the way, not just for this, it's widely used is when it's voluntary. So for example, some factories have agreements with their utilities where when the utility notifies them, we need you to curtail demand, say, for example, on an extremely hot August afternoon. So there's 2 or 3 hours, maybe even just 2 or 3 hours a year, or 2 or 3 hours in the summer when they're like, you know what? You got to turn off your factory. Just ramp down what you're doing, and we'll pay you a lot of money to do that because you're going to solve us. You're going to avoid a blackout or a brownout. Companies will voluntarily do that because they get paid for it. So a long way of saying there's a lot of demand curtailment that goes on out there. By the way, some individual consumers will do that too. They basically agree that they'll reduce their load in order to get a lower rate on their bills. But I don't know if I've ever seen a government force it. At least not here in the US. Any other questions on the tech side? I want to move on, but I'll take one more and then we'll keep going.
The map you show about the increase of the electricity.
Yeah.
I noticed that most, around the data centers, increase has been substantial, but there are 2 places on which the electricity
went down.
Yeah,
you have good eyesight there. Yeah, much better eyes than I do. Yeah, there are a couple places. So, what does anybody know? What those places have a lot of? You say water? They actually have a lot of wind. Super windy parts of the country. Power is really cheap in those places. So cheap that in some parts of the country, they're often negative prices. Because wind generation is already built and running. Now, as I said, wind for political reasons has slowed down a lot. Subsidies got knocked out by Trump, and then he's just making it difficult to build new wind. But for existing projects, they generate enormous amount of power very, very cheaply where it's windy, which, by the way, isn't much of the country. There's only certain places. And those places, the Panhandle, Texas, West Oklahoma, up through the Dakotas and stuff, you get a lot of wind. So that's probably why those prices have actually gone down, not up.
Isn't that the case for solar, like especially Phoenix and Texas?
Yeah, mostly just there's been so much growth in demand for the power. Would be the main reason. I think you will see solar. Well, let's just see what our solutions. I want to take you through the rest of the story here, and you'll sort of see how these things play out against each other because it's kind of a messy picture. But I think it still informs us of a few things. I'll come back to your question. All right, so generally speaking, when you think about adding power generation, utility or your Google or whatever, what do you think? What are the key factors you need to consider when you're selecting among these different power generation sources? And historically, by far the most important one has been cost. You always take the cheapest electrons, right? Because again, it's a commodity. Why would you pay more for this pure commodity? So the levelized cost of energy, a so-called LCE, usually wins. But AI companies are willing to pay more. Why? Because there's something we call speed to power, right? They need their power quickly. They need it now. And it's a small percentage of their spend. So they're spending hundreds of billions of dollars building out these data centers. And although electricity might be expensive, more expensive than it was, it's a small percentage. Without the electricity, all that other spend is wasted, just sitting there empty, right? So they will spend more. So that's upending the economics of the whole thing. Secondly, they need firm power. They need, I said, mostly firm power, because in theory, they can actually interrupt their processes. And by the way, when you even run inference, when you request something, the customer is willing to come up with a slight delay, 10, 20-second delay. You don't love it, but people are kind of used to that. They're used to the idea that, chat is thinking on your behalf. Doesn't really think, but you know what I mean. But they basically need 24/7 firm power. The third issue that's come up is, whoops, I don't know what's going on here. They need distributable power, which means they need the power near to where they're building data centers. Now, why is that? Because, of course, the whole country is connected through a grid. Actually, 7 grids, but essentially through a grid, right? The problem is that if your power generation source, the new power that you're adding, is not next to where you need it, you need to build transmission lines. The grid as it currently exists is basically mostly maxed out a lot of places. And building transmission takes a long time. It's also costly. But again, back to the speed to power problem, you don't want to have to put wires in. And then lastly, CO2 emissions do matter. Basically, every major tech company has pledged to get to net zero. They do take these things reasonably seriously to an extent, right? So these are our key factors. So what does that mean? Well, first of all, when it comes to cost, what's cheapest today? I mentioned that before. What's cheapest today is solar, wind, and gas. If all you think about is cost, those are your winners. This complex looking chart, it's actually freely available. It's put together by an investment bank called Lazard. They make us available. This is the 18th version. They do it every year. And it just tells you what's the cost of different power generation technologies and compare it to each other, right? We're talking speed to power. What's fastest to build? It's solar. Solar, you can build a project in 6 months. Now, the actual project will take you a couple of years because of all the permitting. Permitting will take a couple of years, the interconnection agreements and so on. But the actual construction, as you can see, it's like maybe 6 to 12 months. It's super fast. Gas takes much longer. And we're talking about things like, well, hydro's, there's not much potential. The others just take a really long time. So they lose the speed to power race. CO2 emissions, you probably know this, but obviously the neat thing is all of these are zeros, except gas. And gas is, of course, roughly half coal, but it is still emitting. So what I want to sum up with, and then we'll just talk about the climate implications, is how do you sort of compare all these factors across these technologies? And that's essentially what this chart is. So we think about wind, it's cheap, it's sort of fast, not too fast, but it's not firm. It's not 24/7. It's only when it's windy. It's very location specific. You saw on the map, which doesn't map well with where we need the power. Of course, it's good on CO2. It also has a hostile administration today, supply chain problems, permit delays. The wind industry is in a very bad way in this country. Solar plus storage is cheap, it's fast, it's relatively firm. So if you have battery storage, you can take solar from the day and use it at night, but you don't have multi-day storage. So it'll take you through 24 hours, but it won't take you through a couple of days of clouds and rain. It's somewhat location specific. I mean, there's sun everywhere in the country, but some places are much sunnier than others. There's a huge number of projects. There's a lot of permitting delays. And this has less to do with Trump and the administration, though they've caused problems. More to do with local communities. There's been a lot of pushback against solar. You can just drive upstate, New York State, you'll see signs, no solar, and stuff like this. People are just hostile to these projects. Nuclear SMR, right? This is not traditional nuclear and this is not fusion. SMR nuclear, big benefits. It's firm, good location. You can put it anywhere, good CO2, got bipartisan support, but it's pre-commercialization. No one knows what it's really going to cost. And no one knows how long it's going to take, but it's going to take a long time. Geothermal, again, similar. It's firm, CO2 benefits, bipartisan support. But again, this is a little bit early. We don't really know what's going to cost. It's going to come faster than nuclear, but it's going to take a little while. Our traditional natural gas combined cycle, the big power units you see it on the New Jersey Turnpike and so on. Big advantages, except it's actually somewhat slow to build because you can't get the turbines. And of course, it emits CO2. Natural gas with fuel cells, it's an expensive solution, but it's an easy, fast solution, right? It's available, but it's costly. And then demand curtailment is your perfect solution, but no one knows if the AI companies will actually use it or be willing to use it and under what scenarios, right? So we need to sort of think about this and then say, well, who is going to win here? Which of these solutions is going to get built? And what does that mean for us who care about climate, right? So here's my concluding points. We know the AI growth is going to require unprecedented growth in US power generation. We don't know if that's going to happen for like the next 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, because actually nobody knows really what the demand curve looks like for AI. Nobody knows how much power these data centers will need in the future because the chips are becoming way more efficient. But at least for the next 5 years, I think there's just no question about what's going on. There's a lot of new sources, each with advantages and challenges. We just talked about that. What's likely to win? Solar plus storage. Solar plus storage is incredibly well positioned. And natural gas, fuel cells, and combined cycle are going to take a lot of the growth. Wild cards, if nuclear SMR develops reasonably quickly, you will see a lot of it. Enhanced geothermal, you will likely see a lot of this new technology coming online. And you might see a lot of demand curtailment. But I call these wild cards because we just don't know at this point. And there's a lot of money being bet on each of these, at least the first two options today. A lot of investment capital going there. What does this mean for climate change? Growth in solar, battery storage, nuclear, enhanced geothermal, these are all good. It's not just good because there's zero emissions. That's good. So whatever power demand, again, we don't have more emissions. But they're also good that as those industries expand, the cost of those technologies just keeps coming down. The more investment in those products, the more manufacturing facilities that make those products, the more human capital that's behind those products, the more expertise, those become the incumbent solutions for the future. And that's beneficial for us. Growth in combined cycle natural gas, those big power plants that you see today, more of those is negative. Because once they're built and running, it's hard to shut them off. That's not going to help us. And the fuel cells, they're kind of a funny thing because they may get repurposed to use hydrogen. They may get repurposed for backup power because they're quite expensive to run. And I didn't add this to the slide. When I was visiting Bloom last month, they showed me they're actually designed also for carbon capture. So they have carbon capture built into them. Now, the customer has to have an incentive to capture the carbon, but it's quite easily done. It's already in there. And they show me, just need to then store it, which has a cost associated with that. So that's the takeaway. Questions on understanding how these technologies compare, how we think about them, or the conclusion, most importantly, the conclusions. Anything at all? Was that helpful for Zoom?
Thanks. Super interesting. So I'm just wondering from like a very naive perspective, in terms of regulation, is it possible in our, lobbying, all these different regulation systems that there could just, instead of having a wholesale market, you price based, like your price changes as a function of demand. So if these companies are demanding some very large...
function does change. Wholesale market is driven by supply and demand. Like any market, that's what sets the price. So it is driven by demand. But your bigger question is like, can policy help us here?
Yeah. Can the government say you can charge like the the AI companies have to take this
Yeah.
cost and
So
passing it on to.
it's likely there will be some policy around this. And it's not because, you know, someone's sitting there and going, well, we got to really solve this problem because the world's changing. It's going to be because the politics, all policies downstream from politics. And the politics are going to get really ugly soon when people start to see their utility bills going up. And so you already see the hyperscalers getting ahead of it. They're already saying, oh, we're doing things to make sure power prices are going up. We promise to not affect the grid. More and more, they're putting the power behind the meter. That means they're putting the power on site so it doesn't affect the grid. So there is already stuff going on here at the moment, more voluntary, because everyone can see where this is headed, and it's kind of ugly. I suspect regulators will step in at some point, again, because the politicians will force it. But there's a long history of power markets being difficult to regulate effectively. As soon as, let's say, one state or one area, one community says, well, we're making it so you can't increase our bills, it sends a signal to these companies, don't go there. It's a big country. They'll go somewhere else. And so in some ways that might help like one community, but it doesn't help us to think about, well, what's this mean for the whole country? The short answer is, unless something dramatically changes with AI, power demand is going to go up, and it's got to come from somewhere.
In terms of,
Oh, sorry, I guess for Zoom, we need that, I suppose.
You're showing this map where electricity bills are going up. I was just wondering, how is that linked also to water availability?
Yeah.
Like, for example, these places can have like electricity bills go up, and also like there will be a shortage of water sources.
Yeah, there is a water issue around this too. I don't have any expertise on that, to be perfectly frank. I think what you'll hear from people who are closer to it is there is a problem in some places for sure. But most of these centers recycle water, right? And the ones that are very efficient, they recycle it entirely. So while they initially have a draw on water, they keep using it. The water problem we have in many parts of the country is a complex problem where the markets aren't pricing the product properly. So you can talk about price of electricity. Is it too high? Is it, we need government involved? In many parts of the country, water is wildly underpriced, and that's why we're running out of it, right? And then you say, well, there's an easy solution to that, make people pay what it's worth. But that is a policy nightmare because nobody wants to pay for water. We're essentially used to getting the most valuable resource we have, next to oxygen. It's the other thing we need to live. And we're used to getting it for almost free. And now you're suddenly saying to farmers, to consumers, to people, to all of us, oh, you got to pay more for this thing you're used to getting for free. That's a big political issue there. That being said, again, just like power, it's manifesting itself, and the data centers are going to push that as well. I'm not sure the water demand though is as big as people think. Again, because it's recycled. Whereas power, you of course constantly need more power. Sure. Yeah. Then we'll move it up here.
I have a question maybe off topic, but how does the power demand by AI growth compare to, for example, to crypto mining demand?
Oh,
I think it's a bit old.
Yeah. So crypto mining uses a lot of power as well, but first of all, a lot of that has moved outside the US where power prices are even lower. But what's actually happened is a number of crypto mining operations realized it was far more profitable to be a data center for AI. So they're repurposed. There's a couple of interesting stocks, very strange stocks. I'm not that interested in crypto mining. I don't know much about it, but you have these bizarre companies that's what they do, right? Crypto mining, who have rebranded themselves as AI data centers because the valuable product they have is power and also the infrastructure. They can, rip out those servers and put in, rip out the mining equipment and put in the AI chips. So and it's not growing that fast. Like the crypto industry has been growing, but it's nothing like this. The key point here is not, what's happening here is not, we have this new industry, it's growing and needs more power. We've seen that story over and over again. You can pick any industry you want. It's the rate of growth and the scale of it. I mean, these places are just huge. And that's what's turning everything upside down. Because if you asked me this question, 3 years ago, I would have said, well, it's easy. The cheapest power source is always the next one that wins. We just look at what's cheap, and that becomes our next solution. Over time, it takes market share away. Now it's chaos because of the size and the speed of what's changing.
Yeah, you said wind is winding down due to admin pushback, subsidies ending. What's the reason or the cause for that pushback? And also, is it the same for onshore and offshore?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm sorry I made a face because, the cause is one individual, really. Now, let me be a little more serious about my response. Offshore wind has a problem, which is offshore in America, it's a very expensive power generation source. It really is. And so it's been heavily subsidized to make it work. It's expensive because putting anything offshore, it's a really harsh environment and you got all the extra costs. And we also don't have the infrastructure here to really do it. So you need to build new ships to move these turbines offshore. You need new engineering, you need everything. And fundamentally in the North Sea, where you've got a lot of relatively cheap offshore, it's a perfect location. It's very shallow, North Sea, super shallow, and super windy. Whereas offshore America is by and large not very shallow, and there's a lot of challenges. A long way of saying the pushback on offshore wind is partly the Trump administration, and partly the economics were not very good to begin with. So it's an easy one to say, maybe we shouldn't do that. Onshore wind is a whole different story because onshore wind is really cheap and the infrastructure exists, it's all there. And this comes down to the industry's not stopped, but the subsidies were literally just entirely yanked away. And it's hard to compete with solar, which is keep getting cheaper and these other solutions. Yeah. So it's a mix of politics and economics. Yeah. A bit unfortunate because it is a good resource, certainly onshore. By the way, just to show you how much things have changed, I introduced that company Bloom that makes these fuel cells. This is not a new company. It's been around for like 20 years, maybe 25 years. It's not a new technology. Fuel cells have been around for a while. The company's been public for a long time. And the value of the company is bouncing along for years. They were like, this is a good way of generating electricity. We can make it clean. We can use hydrogen. Everyone's like, yeah. Nice. And all of a sudden, literally in 18 months, it's a darling. It's now a $50 billion company from this little tiny thing. Why? It didn't change. The world has changed. And that's why he's saying, when I say chaos, that's sort of what I mean by it. Sorry, let me just check one second. Yeah, I take one or two more questions, and then I have to run. I'm sorry.
In terms of the solar power, do they have to rely on forecasting accurately? And also, do they have any? Yeah. Then do they have any issues with fallback on the grid? And does that cause financial issues for it?
When you say fallback, what do you mean?
If they can't use the solar power to generate the data center, then they have to fall back.
Yeah. So yes. So the first question is actually easy. We call it insolation, which is how much energy is coming from the sun each day in a particular spot. And the forecasts that are very accurate, actually. And you can actually get government data on that. It's very accurate. And so solar performance is very stable. You can forecast it very well, very accurately. And wind, by the way, is much harder to forecast. So there's a lot of government data. You can also put on your own towers to measure the wind speed with anemometers. It turns out wind is a much trickier thing. So that's not a problem. Your point, though, about this, what's called the intermittency of solar, the fact that it's only sunny during the day and then certain days is not so sunny and so on. Sure, you can forecast it, but of course, moment to moment, that changes. A cloud passes over, what happens, right? And so the data center either has to fall back on the grid, fall back on another power generation source, or this is what the primary solution is batteries. And I guess the last thing I would leave you with is the growth of the lithium-ion battery, which we all use in all our devices, is a miraculous invention, because the fact that we can now store power, of course, allows us to have all our devices, but it also finally allows us to store power now quite cheaply anywhere we need it. And what this means is not just, okay, I got solar and I got battery. Okay, I get that now. I can see how I can store it. It means that how we manage the whole system, the entire grid, think of all these wires everywhere and power being generated and power being used, millions and millions of different nodes. Batteries allow us to smooth that whole thing out. It allows us to go, wait a minute, we've got excess power here, and we don't need that power right now, but we know we probably will need it in a few hours. Let's just store it. And so you see the fastest growing part of the energy markets today is batteries, because these devices allow us to actually really take an aging and old infrastructure that's not suited for the 21st century and make it way more vigorous, useful to us. You'll see a lot of battery development, which isn't of itself power generation. It's a way to make generation sources that much better fit for the world we live in today. That was one last nerdy comment on where we're headed, but it's one last thing to keep in mind.
We know you have to run,
Yeah.
but in closing, given that your audience is made up of climate and climate data scientists, and you mentioned investment in human capital and human expertise, can you give us one closing thought about what you think our responsibility in the fields we're in might be to address AI's impact on these energy demands?
Yeah, so I think it's a great question that obviously doesn't have an easy answer, not only because I don't know exactly what you guys do, but more importantly, because we don't know where all this is headed, right? This whole AI thing is coming on fast and hard, and it's going to probably have a lot of implications. My advice would be you get a lot of knee-jerk reaction to this. The growth in AI is bad when it comes to climate. It's got to be bad because it's using more water, using more power. It must be bad. And I think it's really important, whatever kind of work you do, is to understand in what ways is it likely to be bad, because it is in some ways, more burning of gas, more use of water in what sense, in what ways is it could be bad, but doesn't have to be. Like if you recycle water, that may solve that problem. Are they actually doing it? And then what ways is actually likely good? Like if it drives demand for more use of batteries, solar, clean energy, if it drives this new geothermal technologies and so on, it actually will have very good implications. And then, of course, there's the flip side question is how does using AI, of course, help us make all this work better? It's an incredibly complex set of factors. And what I caution people is just don't jump to conclusions. Just try to figure out what's going on and then assume that your assumptions aren't going to be right. Because even the experts don't really know what's going to work out. So keep your assumptions dynamic and keep on top of this, because it has a lot of implications, I think, for all of us, really, on the who care about climate change. Yeah. I'm sorry I have to leave a few minutes early to do another talk at the other school over there. So
Thanks so much, Bruce.
my pleasure. Thanks.